Good evening, everybody. Keith here. Hoping everybody's having a good day, enjoying life, living life, loving life. Wanted to talk to everybody tonight about this probation thing everybody's on. Probation and parole and everything. And everybody knows me about them words. Probation is one of them words that you really should be paying attention to, especially if you're on probation. Same goes with parole. It's the same kind of conditions under the terms of a contract. Okay? And again, we're going to talk about authority. And when it comes to these court cases, I want to point out a question that really sets in my mind, because I've been on probation before, and I've had my probation revoked. That probation is, in regards to the legal term, is the probate of a will. That's what we're talking about. And that's the will of an estate. Not the will of a trust. It's the will of an estate. And that's what they're doing in these courts, is they're probating the estate. And that's an executor des tort. They are acting as an executor of the estate through probation. Probate, to prove. Probate will, to prove will. So if you're on probation, you hear people tell you all the time, then you're on probation by consent. And that's because you're allowing them to prove your will by asserting their authority. So here's my question. Why is it that when probation is revoked, that a public defender needs the permission, the grant of the probation officer to file charges? That's his duty. Somebody's granted him the duty to do that. Isn't that a power of attorney? And what I want you to understand is, I thought about this and I thought, well, wouldn't that be making a legal determination, practicing law, da-da-da? And by technicality, you might be able to get him on that. But at this point, it's just better off saying somebody else granted him powers of attorney. Now, those powers of attorney are powers of authority. Powers of authority have been adjourned. They have been adjourned. They have been turned over. Okay? So, and this is why I mean by technicality, you could probably get him for making legal determinations and practicing law without a license, because he is being presumed to now have the authority to do the attorney, to commit the act, to have the intent to force somebody else's will, to do harm, to injure, to trespass, to intermeddle with his private affairs. And now I want to point something out to you on the other end of the spectrum, is that this is a public servant. Okay, he's been hired by the court systems of the state as a probation officer of the court. However, he's still a foreign entity. That's your separation of powers there still. Resides through all jurisdictions, even each private jurisdiction. There's a separation of powers. The separation of powers is the will of the man and the execution of the will of the person who gets his will from the man. Okay? And that's the same thing as with the Ninth Amendment, separation of power between the people and the government. The government is a person, the people is the people. And the person is the person of the people. Separation of powers throughout all jurisdictions. And this is why I want people to really seriously think about this in regards to those foreign agents. Okay? These foreign agents are under contract of good faith and fair dealing and have to provide a statement of non-bribery. And that's uniform throughout all jurisdictions. Okay? So think about this. If it's uniform through all jurisdictions, and that authority has been handed down to the probation officer, and is presumed to have been handed down from an upper authority to the states through that federal contract, Constitution, I want everybody to think about this president. If he's acting in a corporate capacity, shouldn't he have a foreign agent registration document himself, showing that he's not an elected president, an elected official in an office, in a seat of an office of government of the people, and not in an official capacity of a public officer, a public employee, a corporate official, a corporate employee throughout any agency, bureau, program, administration for the corporation known as the United States. I want everybody to understand you're all under probation. You're letting somebody else probate your will, whether it's documented through prison papers or jail papers or just through the birth certificate. You're all being probated. You're all under probation. You're all on probation. Unless you stand up and prove your will. Period. You know, people, I wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for you, and that's how simple it is. I don't need it. I no longer need, I'm still going to do research because there's still plenty more I need, but the basics that I'm pointing out here to you people, I no longer need to do research on it. I know it. And I can walk into any court and point this all out through all the jurisdictions, international, public, and private law. Separation of powers between private and public. Uniform Commercial Code, contract on the international sale of goods. One's international for private individuals and public individuals, and then the UCC is for public individuals, all known to be United States citizens or foreign persons, but never people. Only a person can have his will probated by another without agreement. Because that's an automatic attachment through an incorporation, through a design. Somebody else drew him up, not the creator. So I want you to think about this stuff. Jesus never rebutted the law. He never enforced the law. He proved it. And all he was doing is proving the will. Where do you get your will? Do you get it from your authority, or is it inherent in yourself and you prove it? Do you execute your will? Are you secure in your persons, papers, houses, and effects? And do you execute the will of your person? Do you administrate your own trust and appoint the proper trustee, one that can be trusted in good faith and fair dealings, to buy, sell, and transfer property through personage? Know the separation of powers. So then when we go beyond the UCC and the contract on the international sale of goods, we see it in the Constitution, which is the first, you've got your First Amendment, which clarifies the Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion or the free exercise thereof. The Second Amendment clearly states that you have the right to maintain a militia form in an ever watchful eye over your government in case they exceed those bounds of separation and try to assert their fictional authority on your reality. We see the separation of powers in the Third Amendment, where they're to provide compensation if they use your abode or your facilities or your products or your services in regards to their separate entity of a warring faction, an armed force, a force of arms, but they're to do so at an arm's length. And if they don't do so, that's when you enforce your Second Amendment. Then you have the Fourth Amendment, where it clarifies you have the right to be secure. There's a powerful word right there, secure. We're going to talk about that through the Social Security Administration, the Security Exchange Act. What's the tie there, folks? What's a bond? Obligation and other securities of the United States. So then we talk about the Fifth Amendment, and again it tells you that your property can't be removed from you without a warrant, based upon a warrant, and used for public use without fair compensation. You've got the Seventh Amendment that separates the powers, denoting that there's a jury by trial and a trial by jury. One's a jury trial, one's a trial by jury. Look at the language and you see the difference. Then we have the Ninth Amendment, clarifying that that we have rights that may not be enumerated in the Constitution, which are clearly separate from those that are and can only be enumerated within the Constitution for the fictional entities that we delegate authorization to. And then again, we see it in the 10th Amendment. Again, this is the one that I say we need to restate, reword, correct the wording so it's more accurate in stating that separation of powers. But it does state that the power is not delegated to the United States in the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are therefore reserved respectively to the states or the people. And what that does is it states in a ambiguous sense that the powers throughout all of those different jurisdictions are the same, and they're not. The powers delegated to the states or the United States, either way, are mere privileges. The powers that are delegated to the states are delegated under powers of rights inherent upon each and every one of us. And that shows a separation of powers from each other, as well as the fiction. That's a freedom of association and a freedom to not associate. Both. And then again, we see that separation in powers in the the 11th Amendment, where it defines the 14th Amendment and describes that dual citizenship, which is what I was just talking about, the rights as opposed to the privileges. And then we see it in the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Section 2 of the Constitution. Then we see in the Uniform Commercial Code, it talks about the difference between the authorized representative giving an unambiguous authorized signature on the instrument is not liable for the person named in the instrument. And therefore, we see that separation of powers again in the wording that's used. Okay? And we see the same thing in the contract on the sale of international goods through terms like employee, employer, cancellation, and termination. We see the separation of powers where one's just a discernment that you no longer wish to contract. The other one is based on a breach or a trespass. Not proceeding forward in good faith, unfaithfulness. Unconscionable acts, anything like that can be terminated. Anything else can be canceled. Just because you don't wish to proceed anymore, and that's your power. That's your unlimited power to contract. You can cancel a contract at any time. You can terminate a contract at any time, but if you're going to terminate the contract, then you have to have proof. Otherwise, that contract stays in force retro until you provide proof of termination. Again, we see separation of powers in the terms and conditions of the contract being used accordingly. So you have to make sure you know what you're doing in regards to cancellations or terminations. They're not the same thing. You have to be careful in regards to what you're using when you use things like people and persons. They're not the same thing. Public and private, they're not the same thing. Money and tender, or money and currency, they are not the same thing. Weights and measures and feet and inches are not the same thing. Ounces, things like that. Everything is so ambiguous that you have to clarify things. And it's done very simply through the separation of powers that's uniform throughout all jurisdictions. Now, who's got the power? You or somebody else trying to assert their power through a piece of fictional paper that has no force on its own? They have to be able to stand there with the sword and fend for themselves now. Stand up and fight. Otherwise, you're on probation. You're letting somebody else prove their will over yours. Thereby, you are enforcing their will as your will. Anyway, again, like I said, if it wasn't for you guys, I wouldn't be doing this. God bless. Have a great night.